So, welcome everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Elizabeth Wilcox for her book, The Long Tale of Trauma, in conversation with Dr. Bethany Casarjian. My name is Bree, and I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have you join us in our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of the authors in an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. The chat and question boxes are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so that you can talk to other attendees. And please drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window so that they're not lost in the chat. It can move pretty quickly. And please note that Brookline Booksmith has a very strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Our moderator this evening is Dr. Bethany Casarjian. I'm so sorry, Bethany.
Perfect.
The clinical director of the Lionheart Foundation, whose mission is to create social emotional learning curricula for our nation's highest risk populations. For the past 20 years, she has developed, implemented, and evaluated the impact of asset-based psychological intervention created for adolescents populations, including those in residential treatment, youth involved in the juvenile justice system, homeless, and court-involved teen mothers. Through the Lionheart Foundation, she has co-authored 2 books as well as many other achievements. Author Elizabeth Wilcox has worked as a journalist in England, Hong Kong, and the US. She has extensive experience both as a newspaper columnist, radio presenter, CNBC television news producer, and web producer. She currently specializes in content development and strategy for educational organizations that promote social and emotional learning in early childhood and trauma-informed practices for youth. Tonight we'll be talking about Elizabeth's new book, The Long Tale of Trauma. This is a story of mothers, of daughters, and a story of trauma that we carry and the trauma we tend to. The book is a multi-generational memoir that explores the author's maternal history of repeated trauma, separation, adverse childhood experiences, and their impact on mental health. Set against a 20-year dialogue with her mother, Barbara, who suffers from long undiagnosed PTSD, and reaching back to the birth of her illegitimate grandmother in 1904, a dual timeline that is both present and historical. Elizabeth weaves together both documented and imagined voices of the women who preceded her. And join me in welcoming Elizabeth Wilcox and Dr. Bethany Casarjian. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bree. Really appreciate that introduction. And I want to thank, first of all, Dr. Casarjian for joining this conversation, and also just to thank her too for all the incredible work that the Lionheart Foundation does, helping some of the country's most underserved populations. My book came out yesterday, The Long Tale of Trauma, and I thought I'd begin initially by addressing the structure of it. It is a dual narrative, which Bree just kind of referenced. One of the narratives is a dialogue between myself and my mother, because since I was in my 20s, my mother has always been sharing her story with me. And the other narrative is a historic narrative that is told through the voices of my maternal ancestors. And it opens in 1904 in Rickmansworth, England, with the birth of my grandmother, Violet, who is illegitimate, and she is the child of a German house servant and her employer's kind of ne'er-do-well son. And she is born and quite immediately sent off to live with her 2 spinster aunts. My mother growing up never really knew much about her mother, except the only thing that she'd ever heard is that my grandmother had a very happy childhood with 2 spinster aunts. What I discovered in the course of researching my book was that the actual story was quite different. And my grandmother, when she was 6 years old, her mother came and reclaimed her, if you will, and brought her into the East End of London. And my grandmother, who had led this sort of privileged English life, with, even though she was illegitimate, with two spinster aunts, suddenly was thrust into East End London with a German mother and a stepfather who was Jewish German, and it was 1910, and tensions were building with Germany, and there was a lot of xenophobia, a lot of anti-Semitism, and she was basically living in poverty. And the contrast of those two environments, and to be separated from your biological mother, but then to have these mothers in your life, and then to go back to your own mother in such a different circumstance. As I was discovering all these things about my grandmother, I began to realize what a traumatic early childhood that was for her. And so what I'd like to do is read to you just that moment where it occurs about 50 pages into my book, where Violet has left her two spinster aunts, and she's moved in with her mother into the East End of London. And my story, as I've set it out, is told through different voices of mothers. And it's really an exploration of mothers and daughters, and the experiences that these mothers and daughters have. So this is called Anna, or Anna, as it's supposed to be pronounced. Anna, Bethnal Green, London, 1910 to 1915. Violet's acceptance of her new life took longer than Anna had hoped. That first year, there were so many times when Violet would have an outburst over the most innocuous of things: a lost sock, too many nuts on her cake. Violet's little face would flush, and she would scream or run from her mother as if in need of an escape. At such times, Louis would shrug, knowing better than to get involved. Let her be, he would say when Violet was particularly uncontrolled. And in time, Violet would return, composed as if nothing had transpired between them, the past forgotten again. Give her time, Louis would say, for as composed as Violet often was, both Anna and Louis could see that Violet's forbearance was a thin armor to the struggle within her. So Anna waited, always reminding herself that her daughter no doubt missed her home in Rickmansworth, her pampered life, the attention and sense of belonging she once got. She reminded herself that her daughter's attitude was to be expected, and that, in fact, given her change in circumstances, she was surprisingly restrained. Violet never commented on that single worn couch, or the stench in the narrow stairwell that connected all 6 flats, or the brazen woman above who entertained loud men in her flat at all hours of the night. Yes, she did carry in her a persistent and silent refutation evident in almost all that she did, in the unexpected check of her small head in response to what Anna had thought was a benign remark, or in the stiff way she carried herself through the dirty streets to her overcrowded school. Admittedly, Anna sometimes found her daughter's aloofness difficult to bear, but she accepted what she saw for what she decided it had to be, a means for her daughter to cope. She tried not to feel hurt. She kept no record of the wrongs. Maternal love, she knew, was a love so different from all else, so vast and infinite, with no start and no end. It was a love that since her daughter's birth she carried in every cell of her body, and having Violet home in the flesh was a visible rematerialization of what she had so long held, eternal in space, divine in the true sense, patient and kind, protected and trusted, hoped and persevered, forgiving, just like they said. So that's just one of the voices. That's Anna reflecting, as you could see, on when her daughter joins her. And then the story goes on to trace this kind of historical narrative. You see Anna actually and Violet leaving, and her younger half-brother, George, leaving London because the war breaks out. Her father, her stepfather rather, is Jewish, so he's interned by the British. And they end up in Germany. And here you have poor little Violet, who's grown up thinking of herself as English, and she moves to Germany and she doesn't speak a word of German. And it's the First World War. The story proceeds, and then eventually one finds my grandmother, Violet, marrying my grandfather, George. And they're in Germany, and George is an accountant with Price Waterhouse. And it's just before the Second World War, and they have to flee. And they end up in Holland. And while they're in Holland, Hitler invades. And I won't get into all the details now because it's a harrowing story. But the result is that my grandmother ends up interned in Holland, which is Violet. And my grandfather, George, and Barbara and her little brother escape to London. And they arrive in London, and at the time there was something called Operation Pied Piper. And people may be aware of Operation Pied Piper, but what happened was the government said it is unsafe for children in London. And children are too vulnerable to bombs by the Germans. So we're going to take all you children and we're going to put you on a train and bring you out of London. And there's actually quite a lot of literature around then. C.S. Lewis, a lot of his Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Paddington Bear, those were written within this context. So these children, my mother was age 3 and her little brother was age 1.5, and they were put on this train outside, taken out of London, and they stood on these platforms in Wales and the north of England with numbers around their neck, and strangers picked them up. And lo and behold, it was very traumatic. And for someone like my mother, who was literally 3 years old, she and her younger brother basically ended up living in a series of different foster homes, some of which were abusive. And at one point, my grandfather got a letter saying, you have to get those children out of this home. And my mother went on to basically kind of continue to experience foster homes and boarding school, and had a very difficult childhood. And stopping there in terms of the narrative, what I began to see when I was creating this narrative or recreating this narrative was that there were some patterns here. You had both a mother and a grandmother who had experienced early childhood trauma. And in fact, there's a term for it, which is adverse childhood experiences. And at the time, of course, people didn't know what kind of impact this would have on these women and men, but even more on the women, actually, it turns out. But it was a very traumatic and difficult period and omission for both my mother and her mother in their early childhood years. And there's since been quite a lot of work done around ACE, adverse childhood experiences. And the CDC actually did a report, which I'm going to turn it over to Beth for a moment, because Beth's a clinical psychologist and she can speak to all of this with much more clarity. But there is a report done in the 90s which looked at the impact of adverse childhood experiences and what it was and what it did to children. And so I'm going to pass it over to you, if I may, Beth, to talk about ACE a little bit.
Sure. And I think maybe just a little backstory about, so Elizabeth and I are friends, and one of the things that came up for us as Elizabeth started the process of writing this book was I have worked for my entire career with adolescents who have really gone through a very similar process, but here in the United States, not during wartime, but who have been placed in foster care and residential treatment, who have ended up in juvenile detention. And a lot of the psychological processes that I would talk about and share with Elizabeth in terms of sort of deprivation and early adversity, she was seeing some of the same patterns in her own family history. So it was a really interesting parallel process as she started to sort of peel back the layers of what had been going on in her own family. But it's just really interesting to me when I think back at when I was at graduate school about 20 years ago at Columbia, we didn't talk about trauma the way we do now. We talked about childhood abuse, we talked about neglect, and in one of my very first internship clinical settings. One of my supervisors pulled me aside, and we were looking at sort of a lot of the behaviors of the young people who were in residential treatment. There was a lot of stealing and a lot of fighting. And she really introduced me to this amazing psychiatrist. Many of you may be familiar with him, but Winnicott was his name. He was an English psychiatrist. And he really looked at delinquency as a sign of hopefulness. That during all this deprivation, there was this sort of cry for help, this reaching out. And it really transformed the way I looked at the work I did, and really started to think about it as a strength-based and resiliency-based process. So we can't really help what happens to us, but we can surely, choose the path of our life. So Elizabeth, I will share, if you don't mind, just a little bit about the ACE. And bear with me for a second. As Elizabeth said, I'm from the Lionheart Foundation. I'm the clinical director there. And the Lionheart Foundation is pretty amazing in terms of what it's been able to do as a very small foundation. But basically what we do is we create psychosocial, social emotional learning programming for some of our nation's most underserved, vulnerable, and traumatized populations. And on the left, you'll see Houses of Healing. That's our adult program for incarcerated individuals. In the middle, we have our youth programming. And those are for young people who have been system involved, most of them for most of their lives, residential treatment, detention centers. We also have a program for at-risk young parents. And our latest program is for the staff who are serving these young people. Because what we found is 70% of the staff coming into these roles as direct care staff have experienced their own personal histories of adversity. So I just want to put up a slide of what Elizabeth is talking about when she's saying the ACE. So like she said, there was a large scale study done, and this was a huge study done, and it was not done with a particular population, so like a population that was presenting with mental health issues. This was just done by Kaiser. It was a large scale study that they just asked these questions of people who were coming in for their regular medical checkups. And what they found was that a significant portion of the general population has experienced some of these different types of adversity. And those are things like divorce, or having a substance abuse in the family, or having a parent go to jail, early childhood sexual abuse, not having enough food in the home. There are 10 items that sort of tap what is considered to be these adverse experiences. And I just think it's really interesting. This is from the CDC. And if you look at the bottom, it says general embodiment, historical trauma. And that's really what Elizabeth's magnificent book is about. It's how we carry this historical trauma from generation to generation. Our epigenetics carry this forward. And then the next level up is looking at social conditions and local context. And I think Elizabeth talked about how her grandmother ended up in these slums with poverty, one of the ACE symptoms. And then what she's talking about is the next layer up, which is adverse childhood experiences. And basically, just sort of to step back and give an overview, what they found was the more of these adverse experiences you'd had, it actually shortened your lifespan. And before you get upset or say, oh, wow, I've had a lot of those things, what we know now is that it's not a one-to-one correlation, meaning this is sort of the pyramid where we're trying to figure out what are the mechanisms that take that early historical trauma and actually eventually lead to early death. And one of the things I really want to point out is if you go to this arrow up here where it says adoption of health risk behavior, really what we're finding out is that those are the things that actually lead to shortened life. So if we're relying on substances and alcohol and high-risk behaviors to cope with the stress and the pain of trauma, that's what ends up leading to these early shortened life experiences. And so, Elizabeth, I'm going to turn it back to you, but I just want to, and I'll sort of dip back in later, but I want to also, I really want to share this wonderful sort of Carl Jung quote. I am not what happened to be. It happened to me. I am I am what I choose to become. And I think one of the things is that we really have to sort of hold on to is that we are wired to be resilient and we are wired for health. And I think Elizabeth is going to share that these incredible women who went through this disruption in terms of their childhood and this early adversity, they really sort of went on to live incredibly resilient, hopeful, loving, caring lives and became these incredible mothers. So I think we have to be really careful to be mindful of the fact that just because adversity happens to us, that doesn't really necessarily set us on a path where we can't lead very rich, very loving, very full lives. I think it's just really important to keep in mind that we are wired for health. And I just want to share one last slide. I don't know if you're familiar with the psychiatrist Bruce Perry, or I think it's actually a pediatrician, Bruce Perry, but this is from his book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And I love this quote because to me, it really conveys the hopefulness of healing from trauma. And that is, ultimately, what determines how children survive trauma, physically, emotionally, or psychologically, is whether the people around them stand by them with love, support, and encouragement. Fire can warm or consume, water can quench or drown, wind can caress or cut. And so it is with human relationships. They can both destroy and nurture each other, terrorize, traumatize, and heal each other. And one of the things that we're learning as psychologists is that not only are we wired toward resilience, but we're wired to heal through relationship. And there's a wonderful new sort of field called interpersonal neurobiology. And what it really shows is that what is hurt through relationship can be healed through relationship. And having heard Elizabeth's story and having heard about the women in their family, I can certainly attest to the fact that so much of their resilience has come from the relationships surrounding them. And I don't know if, Elizabeth, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Maybe can you make yours? Oh, that's great. Thank you. So actually, in a way that's a nice segue, Beth, into what my second narrative is. So as I noted in the beginning, I've got two narratives. The first is the historic narrative, and then that's the second. And the first one is this conversation I'm having with my mother, which begins when I'm in my 20s. And my mother has raised 7 children. And I have various quotes spread throughout my book, but one of which is a quote by a fellow by the name of Dan Siegel. And he speaks to the fact that if you are a parent who has experienced a lot of trauma and actually hasn't had a parent, really a present parent in your life, for you to be able to overcome that and to raise children without a model is heroic and amazing. And he doesn't say it exactly like that, but that's the point. And my mother was able to, despite what she endured, despite, she used to say, she was a mother at age 3, despite really not having in her early childhood someone to attach to kind of teach her to co-regulate with her, if you will, which is kind of the regulation of thought and emotion and behavior. And it's something that you learn through the person to whom you're attached to in early childhood. So she had to figure out all these things for herself. And she was resilient and a survivor. And she then went on to have 7 children. And when I first started sharing this story with Beth, she actually gave me Winnicott's book. And she said, your mother, what she's done is amazing, that she's raised 7 kind of well-adjusted children who are emotionally competent, and she had no model from which to work. But when I was in my 20s, my mother was sharing this story, and I just thought I'd write this story of her historic maternal history. But what happened was when my mother, after we'd all left and I was in my, I don't know, late 20s, my father was working for a company, or he started his own company, which happened to be in the reinsurance business and involved in Lloyd's of London. And that was in the that was late 80s, 1980s, early 1990s. And what happened with Lloyd's of London was basically the whole business just kind of collapsed. It was a reinsurance of reinsurers. So basically what happened was insurance companies would carry risk, and then the reinsurers would carry the insurance for those insurers. And then one beyond that were these Lloyd's names. So these individuals who had unlimited risk. And what happened was the basically super funds and asbestosis lawsuits, the whole Lloyd's business collapsed. And my father had a business where he was servicing these individuals who were carrying this risk in the United States. And it was awful. These individuals were carrying too much risk, and it was actually called a long tail of liability. And my father had to close his business, and my parents faced real financial difficulty. And that for my mother was very destabilizing, because she'd created this secure world, and then suddenly my father lost his money because of something outside of that he could not control. And what happened to my mother when that happened is she began to have these symptoms which nobody could pinpoint, and nobody knew what was the matter with her. My father, meanwhile, had health challenges like heart issues and cancer, and we were all very concerned about my father. And my mother had these nondescript illnesses that no one could diagnose, and she was really kind of dismissed for that. And in the meantime, I'm continuing to research this story, and I'm not really paying any attention to my mother and the challenges that she's facing, and she's getting no validation for it. And then suddenly, not suddenly, but one day somebody says, I think you might have something called PTSD. It wasn't quite like that, but it was something. She goes down to the NIH and she shares with them her life story. And lo and behold, she's got post-traumatic stress disorder. And she's got a lot of the telltale signature kind of signs of that. And in fact, when you look at, there've been some studies done on these children, particularly the women who participated in Operation Pied Piper. And close to 50% of the women who were sent out of London, and there were millions of children sent out of London, in late age, they experienced level 2 depression or greater. So, I think about that sometimes now. I think about England and this like keep calm and carry on, this whole generation of our parents and all these. I mean, I'm sure so many of you out there have parents who were impacted by the Second World War or grandparents, this whole generation of people who were really impacted and carry this with them. And in effect, what happened to my mother is these adverse childhood experiences manifested late in life due to a childhood kind of trigger. And to Beth's point, with me, as I had such a hard time. So my first part of this narrative, as I've said, I have a double narrative. First part of this narrative is me talking with my mother and me not able to understand something that Beth often refers to is the mask of trauma and getting to the core self. And me looking at my mother, and often in this story, I'm a sort of petulant 20-something, 30-something, even 40-something, where I'm seeing these behaviors, or I'm seeing this manifestation of the PTSD and not really coming to terms with the fact that that's a mask. That's not my mother. The core self is something entirely different. And something that I think Beth's organization does really beautifully, and I'll let Beth to speak to it more, is this idea of relationships being reparative and using that relationship. And Beth, you can speak better to this than I can, obviously, but using relationship to help people heal and to use that to make connections, to really to carry empathy, to understand that where these people are speaking to you from and who they are. And so this book in a way was a process for me to get to that point. And I still need to get much better. There's still so much self-improvement I need, but it was, for me, it was an exploration of that as much as it was historic, the historic past or my maternal history. So if I may, Beth, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, I think a couple of things come up when I listen to you talk. And one is, there's a great book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's really this sense that, this trauma, we carry this trauma on a neurobiological level. And we do things to cope. And I think that the key here is that, like, trauma impacts the brain. And the brain, not just the brain, but the brain and the body, we're literally carrying it around. And I think that's why there's so much substance abuse when you start to look at people with histories of trauma. We work with incarcerated men and women, and there's so much substance abuse really to numb the pain of that trauma, which is a real neurobiological pain. And so when I think of your mom having experienced that, that early adversity, it never really goes away. It can be worked on, it can be healed, it can be mitigated. We can release it, but the fact that she didn't have an opportunity to do that, it isn't surprising that it sort of showed back up again later in life. So that's one thing, that unless we acknowledge it and that we actually seek out different processes, whatever those are. There's no one right way. There are many ways up the mountain, but you have to pick a path to actually work on that. So that's one thing that strikes me. And the other thing is, I think of a term that is used in psychology, which is alloparenting, which is this idea that we're wired to have other adults in our life actually step in when our own parents aren't there. And I wonder, like, whether your mom had those sort of secondary attachment figures in her life, because she certainly learned some wonderful things along the way. She raised 7 wonderful, vibrant, resilient, healthy, strong, competent children. So I know, I'm really hooked on this idea, the more and more I do this work, that we heal through relationship. And we're hurt through relationship. And in this case, sometimes being hurt through relationship can be by the absence of relationship. One thing we know as psychologists is that neglect is actually as toxic to the developing brain as abuse is. So that is the absence of relationship, the absence of connectedness hurts the developing brain as much as abuse does. So in the case of deprivation, whether that's the deprivation that your mother experienced or the deprivation that abused and neglected kids experience in our own country, that actually hurts the brain. And what we're learning is that relationship heals the brain. So I wonder, as I think about your mom, what those sort of secondary attachment relationships were like in her life, because she got some good stuff somewhere along the way. And that to me is so hopeful, because we can go through these truly adverse things, and yet there are ways for us to really, rewire the brain. We're literally, with neuroplasticity, our brain can literally reshape itself. We know that trauma hurts the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for planning and executive functioning, the amygdala, the part that's responsible for our emotional regulation, and our hippocampus, the part that's responsible for learning. And we also know that good, solid, healing relationship can actually rewire the brain and do it in a really potent way. So I always think, when I hear your mother's story, that somewhere along the line, she got some good stuff. And I think that's what we're learning. The more we do work at Lionheart, is we used to focus on, equipping the young person with with those self-regulation skills, as you mentioned, self-regulation, to be able to inhibit a dominant response, to like yell at a kid, or to be able to take a deep breath before you responded to a kid who was triggered. If we could do that, then what we could do was help that staff co-regulate with that youth, that we could actually model and transmit those skills. And we could do it in a safe environment. And what is safe? And when a brain senses safety, a brain can learn. And in this case, what we're trying to do is help brains learn how to regulate themselves, how to be able to go into the world without being triggered by every provocation or every imagined slight. And so I know that that's what we work on with staff, to be able to help youth heal. And I just wonder, just interesting to me that your mother clearly, some people clearly were able to give her some good stuff along the way.
Yeah, I agree. And, she had some people around her actually in adulthood too. My father was a very emotionally competent, connected person. So, and my mother too, herself, something that I think that, that I just want to, speak to, which is a little off topic, but before I kind of close and we open this up to questions, is that I've been doing a lot of, thinking as this book has come out, and it's a very personal, raw, exposing book. It's a family history, but that other component of it, which is me and my mother, and it's looking at my mother while she's in the throes of really trying to come to terms with this thing that she has that she doesn't have a name for, which ends up being PTSD. And my mother, who always shared this story with me, what I found after I kind of put this whole narrative together is I couldn't share the history personally without speaking to the impact of that history. And the result is that it's a very revealing and sometimes difficult piece to read, or book to read. And my mother has been so courageous, I think, with this book. And part of the genesis of this book, when I really sat down and started to write it in earnest in the last 3 years, was as my mother was seeing children being separated along our borders, as looking at what was happening to families globally. And she really wanted to make her story known, and really felt that there was a place and an imperative to share the story of the impact of trauma on children. And so I just wanted to kind of point that out, because I think it's a far more courageous act of my mother to share it than for me to write it. And then the last thing I'd just like to do is close with, I've had a couple of really nice advanced reviews. As the book came out yesterday, but I had a few people review ahead of time. And there were two in particular that I think really speak to what the intent of my work is. And I'm going to read one and just a little bit from another, so it doesn't get too boring. And excuse the kind of, if it looks like the beginning is giving myself self-accolades, but so just whatever. But here we go. It takes a skillful writer to tell an engaging story that is one part historical drama, one part psychological analysis, while also an intensely personal memoir. A narrator must not speak too factually as to seem remote, not too intricate with psychoanalysis, while not too close as to allow sentimentality to obscure the impact of the story. Elizabeth Wilcox weaves these elements together in a compelling narrative about mothers and daughters and the legacy of the women in her family from great-grandmother to present. What is real is the story itself. 4 generations of women, 3 of whom faced very difficult life challenges, war, discrimination, separation, abuse, abandonment, who were each scarred by their times and rose from difficulty to make life a little better for their daughters. The author explores the contributing factors, the historical context of the time in which each one lived, the relationships that influenced them, individual personalities, genetics, and the choices they each made. Interwoven is the story of Elizabeth's relationship with her mother. Elizabeth's narratives from youth to 52 years old, show a growing understanding of how women endure difficulty and how these experiences reflect themselves in later years. As Elizabeth matures, she's able to understand her mother's traumatic childhood as a story of the long tail, not only of trauma, but also of resilience, as her grandmother and great-grandmother had also done. Elizabeth comes to understand she is the beneficiary of this trauma and what emerges from it. With understanding comes gratitude, forgiveness, and acceptance. The long tail of trauma is a gift to Elizabeth Wilcox herself and a tribute to Anna, Violet, and Barbara Christine, the women who gave her their stories. So I think I'll just end it there because we're at 7:42, and open it up to questions.
Thank you both so much. That was fantastic. We have a few really good questions from the audience. First, we have a comment. The pyramid that Dr. Casarjian showed struck me. It parallels so many descendants of enslaved peoples in the US. So definitely something that's good to share.
And to that point, and Beth can speak much to it, I thought about that a lot in the writing of this book. This idea of, epigenesis, and again, I'm not a psychologist, but this idea that trauma can alter the expression of your genes. So they've done, there's a study done on these rats, and they the mom rats, the maternal rats or the female rats, they endure trauma, and they develop these behaviors as a result of that trauma, whether it's just some anxiety or whatever it is. And then they found that in the pups, the female pups especially, they exhibited some of those behaviors. So that this sort of layering of trauma after trauma, how difficult that is. So this idea of historic trauma and carrying historic trauma, I thought about that a lot in my book, but maybe Beth, you can speak to that better.
Well, I think, I think a couple things. One, we can't help what happens to us. These things happen, and they are incredibly painful and can be at times debilitating. And so I think we have to recognize and validate those experiences as painful and for what they are. At the same time, we've worked in death row in San Quentin, and we've seen people who have been on death row for many, many years who all of a sudden get a copy of Houses of Healing and start going through Houses of Healing, which is our book for adult incarcerated individuals. And they start doing the mindfulness, the meditation exercises, and they tap in to that core self, that loving, peaceful, wise, almost divine essence of who we are, no matter what's been done to us, no matter what we've done. And it's like a revelation in a sense. And so I think it's really important to know that, I just go back to this fact that as human beings, we have volition and we have choice. And like I said, there are many, many paths up the mountain. It could be meditation. It could be therapy and exercise. It could be intense relationship with people who see that core self, that true nature that remains untouched and unscathed, no matter what has been done to you or what you've gone through or what you've done to others. And that connectedness that we all have. So I want to always just put in this sense of hopefulness that no matter what's happened, we have the ability to experience transformational experiences that change our life course in a positive way. And there are so many people out there and so many resources now. We understand trauma so much better. I have to give a plug for who I think is one of the best psychologists on this planet. Her name is Lisa Najovitz. And she has a wonderful book out there called Finding Your Best Self. And it's a self-help trauma book. And it weaves the best psychology that there is in a really wonderful format. So if people are out there and they know somebody who's experienced profound trauma, there are resources. I highly recommend that book as being both accessible and just, best evidence-based practices. So I think, one thing that I'm really hopeful about is the field has come so far in 20 years, and people find real relief and they find real freedom and real transformation from those. And trauma isn't just one thing. It could be, a terrible car accident. We're finding more and more that actual bullying is such a painful experience. And they're actually doing fMRIs, and they're seeing what social exclusion does to the brain. There's an exercise, I won't take up too much time because I know there's questions, but they basically virtually play a game of throwing a ball to one another. And the person who is excluded, they actually can see brain changes in the fMRI, because as social creatures, being excluded, being isolated, being deprived, being cut off from our family, these are toxic and painful experiences that actually register in the way our brain works. And we can heal and recover from those experiences.
Right. Elizabeth, is there a short reading that you could share with us of you interacting with your mom?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I might do is read a little bit of the beginning, and you will see right from the start, I go pretty strong on right away. So it's the prologue, and it takes place in Fairleigh, Vermont, which is where I live. And there's a quote in the very beginning, which says, "While tails are very rare in humans, temporary tail-like structures are found in the human embryo. Most people aren't born with a tail because the structure absorbs into the body during fetal development, forming the tailbone. Sometimes the tail remains due to a defect during the developmental stage." And then this is the beginning. I'll just read the beginning of the prologue for my work. "This is a story of mothers. This is a story of daughters. This is a story of the trauma we carry and the trauma we tend to. This story begins long before me. It begins with the first trauma my ancestral mothers bore, something passed deep in our wombs from one generation to the next. I feel it lashing when I am changing the sheets on my elderly mother's bed, and she tells me that she has decided I don't like her very much. I don't disagree. I love my mother, but in that moment, as my mother leans against her rubber-capped cane beside a second-hand armoire, I do not like her. But then I am not sure at that moment, with my temper frayed, anybody particularly likes me, most of all, me." And it's really, seeing myself almost, you'll see that in this book, I sometimes emotionally distance myself and saying to myself, I'm not relating the way I need to be relating right now. I'm not helping. I'm not doing what I need to be doing. And yet not bringing myself to do that and to be creating that kind of reparative relationship. And I see something here. And then towards the end of my book, hopefully you begin to see that I start to do a better job of that. In fact, that scene at the end, I redress it in some way. In fact, that was a real scene, as you can imagine. And I'm about to drive my mom back down to Connecticut where she lives. And I just can't believe that I've just behaved in that way. And I go and talk to my husband, who is very emotionally competent. In fact, one of the guests here is a great friend of his who's in the chat. And he will attest to this. And my husband says to me, "Elizabeth, you have to apologize. You need to connect." And so I go and I get in the car with my mother and we have this conversation and I sort of repair it in a way. And there's a follow-on question here. How has your relationship with Barbara evolved since working on and publishing the book? And my mother hasn't read the book until now. She's reading it right now. And I am up every night. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, where is she in this book right now? Because it's so raw and exposing. And my mother's a very strong, resilient person. And what this book has actually done, it started a conversation with my mother that I haven't had before, talking about in the course of the writing, we had a lot of this conversation, but now we're really having it at a much deeper level, which is my sharing with my mother how I felt in a certain situation, and her also saying, you know what, Elizabeth, it's okay that you share this. It's okay that you've written about it. It doesn't depict me in the best way, but at the same time, this is an important story, and I love you, and this is a story that needs to be told. So I think that there's been actually something even reparative in writing this book. And then I just see another question here from Marcella Bullhauer, who's a friend of mine. Please tell me how you researched your grandmother's life. Did you ever meet her? I did meet my grandmother when I guess I must have been 1 year old. But of course I don't remember that. And we knew very little about my grandmother. My mother didn't even know she was illegitimate when she died. And the way they discovered she was illegitimate is my uncle was cleaning out her chest of drawers, and he found a letter in the top drawer that was written to her from her biological father, whom she'd never met. And it said basically, nice to have heard from you. You cannot come and meet me. And it was that which then my uncle realized that his mother was illegitimate, my grandmother. And we've had this kind of parallel research going on over the course of 20 years. My uncle, who is English and was a lawyer by training and is very historically oriented, he did a lot of research and would share it with me. And then my mother recorded her story with me. And so it was really a sort of collaborative effort. And over the years, I've collected all of this material. And then I did a lot of census research. And I discovered, for example, that my grandmother, she was born she was born Violet Bracker, which was her mother's Violet C. Bracker. So I think the C, I don't know, I'm guessing it's for Cross, which was her biological father's name. She was born Violet C. Bracker, and then she was adopted by her mother, and by her new stepfather, and she became Violet Kutschenstein. And then with the breakout of the First World War, as it was just kind of evolving, my great-grandmother Anna realized that the name like Kutschenstein, a German Jewish name, that was trouble. So she changed her daughter's name to Cross, and the name of her son, who wasn't even related to Cross, and Cross was the biological father. So my grandmother actually ended up taking her biological father's name, as did her half-brother, who was no relation, and she became Violet Cross. And Violet Cross, there's so much, you can't come up with a better name than that, but for fiction. But anyway, so she was Violet Bracker, and then Violet Kotschenstein, and then Violet Cross, and then finally Violet Cusworth when she married my grandfather. But to speak to that, it was a very collaborative effort in the research. I see another question here. Did you travel to England or Germany to research your material story? So I actually lived in England. My husband's English, and I lived in England. I was a journalist in England right after college. And actually, I began my research back when I was my 20s. And I actually never researched in Germany. I wanted to actually find much more about Anna, my great-grandmother, but a lot of those records were destroyed in the First and Second World War, I think more largely in the Second World War. And I also don't speak German, so that's not helpful. But I wasn't able to get any kind of information out of Germany, but I did do quite a lot of research in England, and my uncle as well was very helpful, and he's still alive. But he would send me information all of the time about my ancestors and about Violet and her life, to the extent that even when they were trying to escape from Holland, and it was a very harrowing story, which I won't ruin for you because it's unbelievable. But basically, they got the last ship out, but my grandmother wasn't able to get on it. And I got the name of the ship. I found all of these newspaper cuttings about their actual escape, because the whole Daily Mail ran stories about my mother and my uncle and my grandfather trying to get out of Holland. So I got a lot of really great of material.
Sounds to me like your grandmother was really the main character. I'm so excited to read about her.
Yeah, she was amazing.
Well, thank you both so much. That's all of our questions. If there's anything you'd like to close on, or we can say goodnight.
I'm just going to see. I just see one question here that in the chat. So it's something that I just wanted to speak to one thing that somebody has noted in the chat. Something which I did not anticipate in even this early response to my book is that, and even talking about it with people, so many people are impacted by trauma. Either they love or care for somebody who has trauma, or they've carried it themselves, or they have a father or a mother who endured something. And to me, I think it's really important for us to have dialogue around the impact of trauma, and often, we talk about sort of history, and we look at it often through the lens of put on my feminist cap here, through men. We talk about war, and we see things like blown off arms on the battlefield, and often it's a male story. But a story that I really would like to hear told is how women and children are being impacted. And a lot of those wounds are invisible, and we don't talk about it. And we're doing a little bit of a better job now, but it's not a narrative that is often shared. It's definitely not one that we see in film very frequently. And it's always the blood and the gore and all the physical manifestations of war and trauma and adverse experiences. And I think we need to give a greater voice to the damage that's happening. I mean, I think of someone was telling me the other day, after we have something like 20 veterans a day committing suicide, and it's because of PTSD, and it's this damage these people carry. And we can say PTSD, we can talk about these clinical terms, but we have to go further than that, is part of the reason I wrote this book.
Very well said. Thank you. And thank you so much to our audience. You can find us at brooklinebooksmith.com/events for upcoming events. And Elizabeth, Beth, thank you both so much.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you, Bree. I really appreciate you hosting us.
Oh, of course. It was a great time. Good night, everyone.
Bye.